might be the last episode. Are we
This
recording?
might be the last episode of Auxiliary Statements, the one that finally splits us because
Are we
I come out as a
recording?
liberal.
Okay.
We are recording.
There
We
are
are
no.
recording.
I can't see any. I don't have any. You
You have no power.
sound waves. I don't have any sound
Okay.
waves. It's fine. Hello, everybody.
Hello, everybody. Hello, everyone. Another banging episode. It was funny.
And that's the
'cause-
closest we've ever got to like drawing an introduction. You know?
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Auxiliary Statements.
You know.
Yeah, I was really excited to do this. Well, I continue to be excited
Yeah,
to do
I'm
this
sure.
episode, but we both came on the call for the listeners, and I was just like, I have a cold, and you're like, I also have a cold, because like usually when we do a movie, which we haven't done in a long time, it's like, hey, fun, high energy. I also feel like the last time we did a movie, we were in the same room.
Yeah,
But
I
this
think
time-
every other time we've done it, we've sort of watched the movie immediately before
Mm.
then talking about it,
Mm.
which has its own dynamic, I'm sure.
I have no idea what Dan's take on this movie is. Maybe this is the one that finally makes him a liberal. This is the one where you just like renounce Marxism.
Yeah,
Almost
I
got
was-
a genuine spit take there.
I was always a liberal.
We know this. We've known this. Well, for some reason, if you're listening to this episode and you haven't bothered to read the title of the episode,
Or you just think it's some kind of joke.
we think it's some kind of joke. We did watch Loose Change, the 9/11 documentary. That was so funny. No, we are just watching Inconvenient Truth, but it was so funny when I texted you after watching this movie, and I was like, we should do this for the show. It'd be really funny and an interesting thing to talk about. And you like forgotten what Inconvenient Truth was.
which documentaries?
You're like, which 9/11 documentary?
Which of the many 9/11 documentaries?
that would have been
Which
so
I can think
funny.
of two. But anyway,
Well,
yeah, no, we did not watch Loose Change or that other one that was narrated by Woody Harrelson.
I didn't know there was one with Woody Harrelson. That's incredibly funny. Good for him. No, yes, we did watch an Inconvenient Truth. We haven't
What?
spoken about it since we've rewatched it, and it'll be interesting. Let me just say real quick. My partner's doing a project that has to do with like ecology right now, this like research project and like climate communication and stuff. And she'd never seen an Inconvenient Truth. And I was like, oh, we should watch it. I haven't seen it like probably honestly, like right after it came out. And we rewatched it and I had a very visceral reaction to it in like a number of different ways. And I was just like, I think this would be interesting to talk about for the show. So I got you to watch it. And I'm interested to hear our takes because it's so of its time and it's so odd. But at the same time, we'll get into it. Just first of all, rewatching it now, almost 20 years after it came out, what were your kind of first takes?
I mean, there are so many levels on which to approach this, I think. At a very visceral level, it's just very strange to be in a position in my life where I can take a historical view on something. Like now, like I can watch. I guess I could watch a movie from any era in which I was alive and be like, "Oh, here's a historical like representation of history that I sort of lived through." Blah blah blah. But I never ever had such a visceral reaction. Sort of play like a reminder of my position in history, I suppose, because what we are living through, like there've been a few times recently when I've reflected on the reality of us living through history in a way that I had never been aware of at sort of earlier stages in my life for various reasons. Like it's a potentially troubling time to be alive. And I suppose in some ways that fits into this, right? Like we're like what that feeling is representative of is a sort of like maybe we're passing out of like a sort of naive era that we've been living in that I was raised in some respects, and having to grapple with the fact that we do indeed live in history, and in a lot of ways that stuff is sort of out of direct human control in some ways. Like when I say that we live in history, it's like I feel like history is sort of I'm becoming aware of history of this as this sort of like emergent feature of many different sort of like decisions and systems that nobody's necessarily in control of. I feel that feels like quite a good metaphor for our sort of collective blundering into ecological collapse.
Yeah.
But when I say vis-a-vis sort of like reflecting on the past, well, this movie came out in 2007, was it? That's
I
sort of
think 2006.
six. So it's sort of 19 years ago. But I'm thinking more like reflecting on the past 25 or 30 years of like the advance in scientific communication, and a sort of like general lay understanding of what global warming means. It's interesting to look back and reflect on that sort of that, at least this 20 or 19-year history. And my sort of feeling was like this documentary was made at a point where basic education seemed like it was necessary, and it's strange to be in an era now where maybe we've all been exposed to that basic education, and there was a perhaps naive assumption in this documentary that in and of itself would be sufficient to, avert this calamity. I don't know. There's something to reflect on, I suppose.
There's something to reflect on. I mean, yeah, it's that I think is what struck me the most about this, is just how historical this era seemed, because this was done in 2006, but he's very clearly, for reasons that we'll get into here in a moment, stuck in 2000. Al Gore, why would he be stuck in 2000?
One of the other many ways to approach this is
but
the character of Al Gore.
Yeah, oh my God, Al Gore is so funny. I will just say, I think the reason that maybe we watch this movie for like a Marxist podcast, right, is because on one hand, this is a really excellent example of like bourgeois political activism, and like the ending to this movie after he goes through this whole like rigmarole for explaining to you what climate change is, all the terrible things that could happen, a bit of sensationalism, and quite a bit about Al Gore's childhood, which is very funny, which we'll get to. It ends with him being like, and you got it. Maybe I'll put in like a sound clip of his last line, because it's just like,
we have everything we need, save perhaps political will. But you know what? In America, political will is a renewable resource. We have the ability to do this. Each one of us is a cause of global warming, but each of us can make choices to change that. With the things we buy, the electricity we use, the cars we drive, we can make choices to bring our individual carbon emissions to zero. The solutions are in our hands. We just have to have the determination to make them happen.
Totally putting the pressure on the individual. Like, it fades to black, and then there's like suggestions like, you can stop global warming, change your light bulbs.
Recycle. Change your light bulbs.
It's so funny. And it's like, I was definitely raised in that mindset. I was like raised in that mindset, and I was also like very much of that mindset for pretty much still like most of my life, until I came across socialism. And like, it was very interesting to kind of dip my toes back into a liberalism that probably doesn't really exist anymore, and that I felt like was kind of eternal. Like the basic tenets of, Gore thought or whatever is like, it's doing the right thing. It's combating like those idiots in the White House, it's combating like idiot Republicans, and speaking truth to power or whatever. Like, I think that's the sequel to this movie, which I've never bothered watching. And it's like, now that, as you implied, like the narrative is no longer, we just need to convince these people that climate change is real. And now it's just like Republicans and conservatives the world over have just completely changed from it doesn't exist, it's an act of God. Trump is still kind of saying it's China, which is very funny. But like, now that they've just switched their tact to it is real, but who cares? What are you going to do about it? Like, America first, which in hindsight is so predictable, right? And one can predict in the future that that's only going to get a lot worse. It's a trip, and it's a trip because now this kind of like I love science liberalism that Gore is espousing here is still like trying to like tread water. It just doesn't seem very relevant anymore. It's like, maybe I'm just saying that because Trump won the last election, and Biden got so stomped, or I'm sorry, Kamala got so stomped, and like that version of liberalism seems like it's kind of like, okay, you got to come up with something else now to combat this. But it was a trip kind of seeing the genesis of the like, I love science liberalism, trust in science, and then, you know, Gore thought put that on the individual. It was very trippy, especially because like that is just that was like my entrance into caring about politics, because this movie came out when I was really young, and I remember it being such a big deal that like, yeah, it definitely informed my politics for a long time, if I'm being honest, until like Bernie Sanders made his way onto the national stage. So yeah, it's a trip.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there is I do wonder whether the sort of like Republican response to discussions around climate change and the efforts to put climate change on the agenda in the sort of like mid 2000s, or just in that sort of in that first decade of the 21st century, and the sort of like generation of, you know, I mean, it's maybe it's not the first era, but it's an era of what we've come to recognize as fake news, I suppose, a sort of like I mean, like I suppose like the I guess the liberal version of this is like of the sort of like science bro logic is like we would but have access to the truth, and everybody would be on the same page, on my page, agree with me, be a good dutiful liberal, I suppose, if not for like sort of like disinformation sown by, you know, I don't know, Republicans and I don't know, then Trump or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, but like to say that,
but that isn't necessarily an incorrect narrative, right? Like, there was a concerted effort to do that, in the same way there was a concerted effort to convince people smoking was good, you know, or like
yes, thank you, Al Gore's dad.
Yeah, so it's like drawing that like you know, I mean, it's always a trite argument to make, you know, but like in the process of trying to work out how we get from this documentary to where we are now, you're right to highlight that. I mean, both the Trump victories in some ways, as a sort of like quashing of the politics behind this in some ways, but like maybe those are just like we could say maybe everybody agrees, or maybe we could say that like 50% of people were wholeheartedly convinced by this, and 50% of people still think that it's a hoax, you know.
Well, yeah, you go on YouTube videos for this to like find clips, and it's still people being like, this marks when climate change stopped being scientific and became political. This is like, there's no proof that what Gore is saying still happened. I mean, those are like kind of old comments, and I don't know who is still going on other than me. Is still like searching through YouTube comments there. But it's funny because like that logic you talk about there of the Democratic Party back then, it's like, how is that different from Drain the Swamp? You know what I mean? It's like, I guess it's just two different sides of the same liberalism. It's like, we just got to get to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? It's like, we got to get there, pick ourselves up by our bootstraps. Al Gore like so tries to paint himself as, you know, Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington here. He's like, I'm just a humble son of a tobacco plantation owner. It's like, what? Also, fucking Al Gore's dad was a senator, and then when he retired, he was like the vice president of an oil company. So it's like,
you get none of that in this. I didn't know any of that.
You just get all he did was he owned a tobacco plantation.
He raised cattle and owned tobacco, and then Al Gore's sister died of lung cancer after smoking, and then he sort of like had a big moral conversion and like.
Yeah, I know, but it's like even that metaphor doesn't really work in this movie, because it's like, oh, well, once the politicians like destroyed the homes of a bunch of people due to climate change, then I guess that it's going to be fine. It's like, I don't know, like maybe change should happen now. He is kind of saying that. But anyway, kind of is what I'm saying is it's like, maybe like it is just kind of the same side of the Trump Drain the Swamp thing, because it is like, just get our smart people in there, replace them with these corrupt idiots, right? And I think one of the main things I was thinking during this is like, the only reason, because I was thinking like, this guy is a member of the ruling class, right? And he's making, if we're being honest, what is one of the better like communicative, I don't know, communication pieces about climate change that we've ever seen. Like, it's incredibly clear. It is very good.
It's very engaging. If you're willing to engage with the character of like Al Gore, you know, if you're willing to buy into it, which I was to a decent degree.
Well, I mean, he's an excellent speaker. He sets it up very clearly. He walks you through all of the basics in a way that I think it's still good for people to watch if it's like your first thing, about climate change or whatever. But
but whose first thing about climate change is? I mean, what in 2006? Yes, I mean
2006,
that
exactly.
further highlights what the hell are we talking about? I mean,
exactly. It's still important, Dan. I was just wondering, like, why is it that this ruling class Nepo baby was like, who was running for president? Like, why was he able to make this movie? And it just dawned on me. I was like, he was able to make this movie because he lost. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's like he got on the professional speaking circuit that he
and George Bush won.
And George Bush won. Exactly. Like, literally one of the first things he says is like, George Bush, I should have been the president. And it's like, it's so funny because in my head I was like, oh, that, he lost the election 2 years before this. He lost the election 6 years before this movie came out. Another election happened. It's so funny. It's like Gore. Yeah, that was really unfair and they stole the election, but like you did lose.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Anyway, my point is just like, that's why he was able to do this, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Al Gore is Al Gore's narrative in this really is that like, the fact that those machines failed to punch sufficiently clear holes in those ballot papers in Florida in 2000 means that the world is going to end.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's just like the question of this is just like, liberals will still talk about that election being lost and like what could have been. But it's like, it's so obvious that like trying to imagine a rational American response to 9/11, no matter who was in what administration was in power, it's like you weren't going to get that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, the only reason a member of the ruling class was able to make this movie that was like doing it in a very liberal way, but like challenging power and speaking to the real consequences. He would never say this, but like of capitalism, like is because he could, and he could criticize, the party of order or liberty. I guess it would be the party of order, right? Like, yeah, no, he wouldn't have done this if he won. I know that like before he ran for president, he was the climate change guy, right? Like he was going around Congress, like making all these presentations. Probably would have had to ease back on that a little bit if he won. And yeah, it just goes to show like, yeah, idolizing bourgeois, like kind of like bleeding heart, like, oh God, who could have done this? It's like, yeah, maybe the guy who got all his money from like his dad being an oil tycoon and is the like wanted to be the leader of the most powerful capitalist nation of all time. You know what I mean? Whatever.
I mean, when it dawned on me that what was being espoused, I suppose, was if he'd have won, then he would have fixed global warming. Yeah. I was then obviously like I had to try and work out, well, could he have done that? Well, obviously not. Like the systemic forces of capitalism would have been against him, unless he'd been like wildly revolutionary, I suppose.
Which would have been very funny.
Yeah. But I guess it's like his like there's one point in this, like I'd like to circle back to like how it ends in a little while, and like Gore thought, as you say, as to like what his manifesto for fixing this problem is. But one of the points in it is like he sort of just makes the point that like he's trying to make the point that fixing global warming and meeting this challenge head on doesn't necessarily need to conflict with the economic interests of the US or of sort of capitalism in general, but actually could be beneficial because it leads to like green growth, and we're going to have this green industrial revolution and new jobs and green jobs and whatever. And it sort of reminded me that the very first time I ever came across the idea of sort of like green-led growth and green jobs was like when Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, and it sort of just got me wondering, well, was Barack Obama just Al Gore 8 years later in terms of like the liberal response to trying to fix this problem? I don't really know what Obama's agenda was like that was on those issues, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, if Gore took a revolutionary turn and he got elected in 2000, one would imagine he wouldn't be in office for very long. No. You know what I mean? Although that would be very funny. The people's commissar, Al Gore. I mean, it makes you think like that movie does just seem like it is designed to just keep people voting for Democrats. And it's very grim because, like, as I was just saying, this movie is very good at parts. Like, it's very, very good for explaining, global warming. And like, it's good for kind of like the Ben and Jerry's Vermont liberals that this kind of like helped spawn. But like, yeah, I don't know. At the end of the day, it does seem like he says at one point, this isn't a political issue. It's just like, dog. It's like he spends so much of it talking about politics and talking about Bush and all of these veiled jibes and like, jokes at his expense. And, he gets a big cheer at the beginning when he says that he should have been the president or whatever. But it's like, for him to come out and be like, this isn't a political issue is so funny because it like, there are points where it's so obviously a like get out the vote kind of thing. And, maybe like, I don't know, maybe to some extent that kind of helped the Democrats with the next election. But like, by that point, Bush was already so unpopular. Not that obviously he obviously wasn't going to be the next Republican candidate, but like the Republicans were so unpopular that it kind of just seemed like anything was going to be fine. I don't know. It's just very odd. It does just very much feel it's like a bummer that this movie that is so good is also just like, oh man, it's just a Democratic kind of like, I'm not going to say propaganda because that seems like a bit much, but it is very much a like, we believe in science. If you disagree with me, you're an idiot and you're wrong because science is this like everlasting thing. And that is represented by the burgeoning multicultural neoliberalism of the Democratic Party. You know what I mean?
But that's not political.
Yeah, but it's not political. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it seems like that sort of just describes an appeal to thinking of the things that have the political trajectories that have come out from the politics of that era through to our present one, like the sort of the very slow death of the democratic demand for bipartisanship from the Republicans. Like his saying that this is not a political issue is in an attempt to imply that like we could all just get around the table and come across the political divide to solve it. But
yeah, there's like a very cynical reading of this movie where it's like he is a very seasoned politician and he kind of knows that that's not the case. And so it is just a way of like, this movie cost like $1 million to make and it made like $50 million. Maybe it's just like Al Gore on his speaking tour trying to get the next part of his career going. Because like if you were in Washington for as long as he was and your dad was like a career politician, it's like, I don't know, does he believe that? I mean, I guess like his dad was like a Democrat and like a LBJ kind of guy, but yeah, I don't know. It's very odd. There is a cynical reading of this movie, I guess is all I'm saying.
Sure.
In which it's,
I think I mean, it strikes me more as just like delusional messiah complex.
Yeah, he does come out and people are like, yes.
I mean, but the two coincide, don't they? Like an effort to be self-serving and rehabilitate one's career, but like, just this. I mean, I guess there is a reflection on the privileged position that he's in that like he gets to go to these elite institutions as a student and and encounters very early sort of data and discussion about the threat of climate change. But it sort of makes, by proxy of the professors that he had and the education that he had, it sort of like casts him as the sort of like the lone voice calling for action on climate change when nobody else cared. But, maybe that's true. Nothing necessarily nefarious about that narrative.
Yeah. It's just so funny too, because it's like the clips of him going to China are so funny to do these talks, because like he'll be talking with like regional Chinese politicians and like looking at their maps for infrastructure plans. And they'll be like, oh, so what are you guys doing over here? And they're like, we're building coal plants. And he's like, are you going to build a lot of them? And they're like, we're going to build a lot of them. And it's just so funny because it's, once again, this is like a typical feature of like, like liberalism is trying to act like there isn't a world system within which we all operate and that there isn't like a division of labor internationally, right? It's like, that's a little bit, it definitely didn't come across as like red baiting. There was one point where he was like, we're America, we can do anything, we defeated communism, which is so funny. But like when he goes to China just is like a really excellent look into that mind where it's like, and we just need to help these people who are in their developing country, just even like the word developing country or the phrase developing country is so like, it's pretty bad, but it's like, well, dog, they make all your stuff. You know what I mean? It's like, this isn't just some place that's doing things wrong. This is a place that is operating under the fundamental dictates of capitalism, where it's like, they have to produce things like this. And, like we read in the Schwang piece, one of them, I forget which one it was, but they had the metaphor of like smog, and they were like, the smog used to be around the Rust Belt in America, and then all of those factories were obsolete, so it moved to China, and now those factories are slowly moving elsewhere. And there's this kind of like delusion that goes along with that, where it's like you have advanced countries and you have developing countries, and one day we're all going to be developed, right? It's like, well, in reality, that smog just keeps moving. You know what I mean? It's like capitalism is not like doing what it needs to in terms of slowing down its fossil fuel productions based on some kind of like apocalyptic ecological collapse. Like, if it is doing it, it's doing it because it's coming up with like labor saving ways to do it that don't really require coal. But yeah,
there's like one of the things I wanted to circle back to was the sort of tension around his solutions versus like his analysis of the problem, because all the things that we've said of his position are true, right? Like he's like very much stuck in this liberal position. There's nothing like particularly radical about what he's proposing. He expects there to be solutions to this problem internal to capitalism. And as you say, in the end, like, well, his narrative right at the end is sort of like skirting this line between a systemic political response and a personal one. And then, as you say, the end credits are sort of like contain the most sort of like mundane milquetoast offering of options for what one might do as a personal response to this. But I thought that we were going to go in a different direction, or I thought it was possible he was going to go in a different direction, because like the things that he does propose are sort of like simple solutions, like switching to more sort of like energy saving devices and I don't know, more fuel efficient cars and blah blah blah. All sort of felt very much like what he was about to say was we need to legislate on all these issues and like force producers and sort of like have a collective response, to then have him sort of like veer very strongly in the sort of like personal guilt direction. It's not remotely surprising, but I allowed myself a mild amount of disappointment as to like that it ended with that. Like, yeah, ended by going in that direction, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing that made me be like, this is just designed to get people to vote for the Democrats. It's like, once the Democrats get in office, stop thinking about these systemic changes, because like, you should be more concerned about your straws and your light bulbs. But it's funny too, because like, I don't want to come down too hard on that, because like in this era, like people were barely recycling, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like, yes, Al Gore's prescription for stopping climate change and stopping the, glaciers from melting and the polar bears from drowning, and his incredibly funny like bowling alley CGI thing of a polar bear drowning. That was so funny. It's like, yes, his prescription for that is like change your light bulbs, but at the same time, it's like, this was such a radically different era. You know what I mean? Like, this was when people were driving Hummers. You know what I mean? It's like people were driving Hummers. Nobody really knew that like those light bulbs were really expensive. Nobody really recycled. Like, it was good to a certain extent. It's just obviously like, yeah, that's not gonna, like be the big thing. And putting that personal guilt felt very like, okay, this is a political project. You know what I mean? And I don't know. It makes me kind of think like, I suppose first of all, before I go into that, like, what was your experience of when this movie came out, and like, when did you first watch this movie? Did you watch it when it came out?
I didn't watch it when it came out. I think I watched it a few years afterwards, when it was still like
people were talking.
When it was, yeah, I guess when it was still relevant, like at the time when it was of its time. I guess this would have been like maybe 2008 or 9, or
Was it? What was it like in England? Was it as big of a deal? I mean, there's nowhere for you to, I guess, really. But like, was it a big deal? I suppose.
I don't remember. I definitely remember being aware of it. But beyond that, I can't really remember, how in the zeitgeist it was.
I suppose the only reason I ask is because like this was so insane when this movie came out,
Okay.
because it just immediately set off a very recognizable thing now, which is just a massive culture war. Like you, even if you didn't watch it, you had incredibly strong opinions on it. You either like hated it because he was this elitist trying to, tell you what to do and lie to you and, all of that stuff, or, it was obviously correct and you're in like a hayseed idiot if you don't believe it, right? Like, yeah.
I guess the political climate in the UK, particularly around climate change in 2007, 2006, whenever this was, we're like getting to the end of the Blair years. David Cameron has been elected as the Tory leader, and he's going around sort of trying to paint himself as like being a sort of progressive Tory who wants to hug hoodies. And there was this famous propaganda bit of him going to the Arctic and being pulled by a dog sled around to see what to see the melting ice caps or something. I must be misremembering, but like it was in the era when like both parties to some degree in the UK were trying to paint themselves as being, we are the, we're the Goreites, we're the ones that are going to meet this challenge with personal responsibility and proper light bulbs and interest us kind of thing.
Was David Cameron was around? I didn't realize he was around for that long. That's crazy.
Yeah. I think he became Tory leader in 2006, something like that. Jeez. So the same year, 2007.
And then he went out on a high note.
Yeah, there you go.
Real high note. That's interesting, though. That's interesting because, like, yeah, climate change in America was just immediately a culture war thing, and Republican politicians realized very quickly how they could stoke that, to a certain extent, create it, and set themselves up as the, to their real base, meaning, like who they actually represent, like set themselves up as the party of like order. We're gonna, or I suppose actually like economically, maybe the party of liberty, just because they were like, fuck it, drill. Like, I mean, this is what Trump's doing, right? It's like, opening up new oil fields, all of the extractive industries, really setting themselves up, signaling to those people, like those capitalists, we are in this for you, while maintaining like a base of voters who like, didn't want to give up their SUVs, I guess. You know what I mean? Or were like petty capitalists who had an interest in this stuff. It was really quickly, really rabid, which is one of the reasons why it's so funny. Well, not funny. It's very grim, but like, whenever a Republican gets elected, at least in my life, everybody likes to act like nobody that crazy and stupid has ever been elected, which to a certain extent is true, because like each one is crazier and stupider than the last. Case in point, the current president. But like this movie, when I said I had a visceral reaction to this movie, and I think like the Ali G show are like the perfect encapsulations of just how fucking psycho the Bush years were. Because like, not only was he, I don't know, I grew up in California, like whatever, like I was like a, John Kerry liberal, but like, not only was he just like the stupidest person anybody had ever seen, and he played into that obviously, but he was doing so many evil things. And like the war in Iraq was so, like his war in Iraq, meaning not his dad's war in Iraq, like it was so much worse than people remember. Like I remember being a kid and my parents wouldn't let me get the mail because they were like, you're going to get anthrax poisoning. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, I don't know. It was so crazy then. And to kind of, just to be dropped in to that era just for a little bit, it's like, it's very depressing because you remember how, on one hand, Trump isn't really like this new crazy form of politician. He's just that amped up to 11, which is what people were saying about Bush when they were comparing him to his dad, and the same thing about him. They were comparing him to like Reagan, right? Like, you go back and you look at cultural kind of like signifiers of the Reagan years, and it's like parents not letting their kids listen to like suicidal tendencies,
play
or
Dungeons
watch
and Dragons,
like, or play Dungeons and Dragons, or get the new Bone Storm or whatever. Like it's, I don't know. It's just very crazy. And the one thing that the Democrats are able to do very well when they're in power, and what Gore is trying to do in this movie, is like pretend that there's a normalcy that you can return to, when it's like, okay, after Bush, they beat McCain, they beat Romney, but then it's just like, whoa, did they not know what they were getting in the next Republican candidate? But like, my only thing I'll say is like, I beseech liberals, I beseech you, go back and watch some media from the Bush years, because it was so much crazier than you think. Like, yeah, what are you gonna do?
Yeah, it sort of reminds me, but it makes me. If I put myself back in that era, I'm trying to think about like I feel like a common sentiment in the UK probably would have been that like US politics is crazy, most Americans are crazy, like they'll believe anything, or
has
like...
that changed?
Well, I mean, the percent that being the British narrative about American politics and Americans probably hasn't changed, like, and so I don't know what I almost said was like, my imagining of this era was that all British people were Goreites. but actually it might just be my personal recollection of who I was and who I was surrounded by was like, the personal responsibility reaction to these issues, but also the let's be rational, let's not let all of these Americans are irrational, and we Europeans are enlightened, in the face of that.
I mean, that was like I had the reverse when Brexit happened, because I was like, you fools. Then Trump got elected, and I was like, oh, fuck.
Hey, you had six months of,
yeah, of snobbery. Yeah, we're all Atlanticists at heart, Dan. I think one more interesting thing I'd like to touch on, just because, like, again, I think that the lesson to learn from this movie, if there is like a ladder, why are we doing this? But like, it's just really interesting seeing the way that kind of like, I called Gore like a ruling class guy because he objectively kind of is. But really what this movie is it's a very bourgeois attempt to solve a very real problem. Like, I'm not trying to say that Gore isn't trying to solve this problem. It's just that he's just, if he does think this is going to do it, his little PowerPoint, it's, obviously insane. So funny. All of the shots where it cuts away to him working on the PowerPoint. And there's literally one where he's putting in a transition. It's like, oh my God, he's on a little like early Mac laptop. It's so funny. Yeah. But my point kind of is like, it was, aside from all of the cultural things, like, it was very interesting being dropped back into this period where climate change had really forced its way, right, like, onto the national stage, and forced like bourgeois politicians to actually talk about it. And whereas then it was Gore really trying to do the kind of like, the bourgeoisie is probably like kind of good at this, at least the like more progressive ones, just like explain to people that this is a real problem. Obviously their counterparts are going to come back and use it as like a culture war and kind of like try and split the working class that way. But whereas that was the problem then, like, the problem very much is now, like, it's progressed. Like, there are very few people other than, like, really committed, diehard, like, Republicans or whatever. Like, there are very few people that don't at least recognize climate change as a threat. And, that's taken like a series of massive natural disasters in the United States specifically for like Americans to really kind of come to terms with it. But it obviously really speaks to the limits of this kind of communication style, this very like bourgeois communication style, where it's like, okay, now we all know that it's a problem, but now what? Like, that's why it's been interesting to see so many socialists recently, like, really take on the tact of, okay, the best strategy to talk about climate change is to kind of push back against the Anthropocene narrative, right? Where it's like, this is just being caused by people and people are just bad inherently or whatever, like overpopulation, which is a narrative that Gore kind of tries to push in this a little bit. Like, now the kind of progressive narrative is to recognize it as like the capitalist scene, where, this is a, problem that stems directly from capitalist social relations. And that way I do feel like we've actually really progressed. I do feel like there actually has been a change in narrative. But again, this is like the limit of this kind of communication style. It's like, okay, we've communicated it. The bourgeoisie has fulfilled its historical function of, educating the vanguard of the working class about climate change. Like, where does the action come from now? And it's interesting, it just got me thinking about, what the different pedagogical styles of like the left of the bourgeoisie and like the actual left of the working class would be, like the socialist left. Now it seems like it does just come down to action, because what I don't know. It's hard. Like, I don't really know how to kind of communicate what I'm saying, other than just like this communication style feels very outdated, and I'm just kind of trying, I guess, to like spitball what a socialist response to it would be, because the ruling class is kind of running out of ways to push the blame, and like, what I suppose is the next step, I guess, a socialist inconvenient truth. That would be very funny.
I mean, I guess the radical solution that can be offered would be one which combines a solution to the ecological crisis with one that overcomes the other myriad contradictions of capitalism that lead to the extreme suffering of a portion of the world population. But this is a general degradation of the living standards and the welfare of the vast majority of the sort of population, even of the West, who are being made poorer and poorer. So yeah, it's pairing those two solutions. The solution to the climate crisis is also socialist revolution, I guess.
Yeah. Or I mean, I guess just even in a basic way, like the solution to the climate crisis is also the solution to why you don't have like a place to live or like cheap rent, right? Like the housing crisis,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's bad incentive structures of the economic system which lead to both the housing crisis and the ecological crisis.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because like one tactic he takes here in terms of like trying to politically motivate people is like sensationalism. And the movie's been critiqued a little bit for this, because kind of like rightfully so. Like, he does these graphics about like all of Greenland's ice will melt and the world will be inundated by a biblical flood. And it's like, okay, well, like even now where we know how much worse things are, it's like, that's not going to happen for a while. That would be insane. You know what I mean? But like he does this sensationalism, which to me felt like a way of just mass overwhelming the viewer to kind of get them to listen to him and get them on board with his political projects. You just kind of go, holy fuck, like this is bad. But it's interesting because I think it's not quite that. Like maybe the science wasn't necessarily there for this. I don't think that's actually true. But like he really only talks about global warming here and the direct impacts of that. He doesn't talk about soil erosion. He doesn't talk about like the ability to continue to grow food. Like there's a reason for that, I think. And I think it's because he needs to kind of like I'm going to stop saying like Gore needs to do this. I'm just going to say that like this is what the progressive section of the bourgeoisie needs to do to get its climate project like together. Like they need to overwhelm people and frighten people, but not make them so existentially afraid that they're going to realize like, oh, the only way to do this is to just fucking like, we have to completely rehaul society. Like we can't just elect Al Gore. You know what I mean? Because like, if he started talking about like soil erosion and things like that, and like the biodiversity crisis and pollinators and things like, yeah, I don't know if his like, Ben and Jerry's University audience would have like, they probably would have been like, oh my God, what's the point? And, that kind of gets us to what we talked about a little bit with Jason W. Moore, which kind of shocked us, where he was like, this is an opportunity. We shouldn't be, climate doomers. We should really be thinking about this as an opportunity because like, yeah, as we know, meaning you and I, Dan, it's very easy to just be like, oh my God, in the face of all of this. But yeah, again, I suppose that comes down to what I was kind of trying to get at earlier, which is like the pedagogical style of like the ruling class when they do need to get past something that they're kind of clearly causing. Like it's very much just verbal and it's, liberalism. It's like we can work together across the aisle to work this stuff out and come up to a solution. Whereas like the socialist one recognizes how structural these issues are and are not just like verbal and PowerPoints. It is actual action. And it's kind of like educating people for action. Like, Yeah. It was a trip. It was very much a trip. The sensationalist stuff in this is really interesting because it's like, Gore, you don't need to like pretend that Greenland's going to completely melt. It's bad enough, dude. It's like,
Well, I almost felt like there was some degree to which he was underplaying certain things, or like things are worse than
well, when
what
he
they
gets
could
on the
see at the
scissor
time.
lift, when he does his famous scissor lift thing, I was like, oh, he didn't go that far up. Like knowing what we know now.
I was like, you don't like, he doesn't like most of it, like he doesn't actually have the data to extrapolate enough to show it the sort of like the true terrifying nature of the trend. It's interesting. It's an interesting question of that sort of the temporality of that, though. It's got to be like apocalyptic, but far enough away that there's still time to do something about it, particularly for that solution to the problem. Like we can do this, and this, and we can bring emissions down by this far, and we can switch over to this, and we can remodel this economy in this way. Like there has to be a solution that fits, that sort of like makes sense internal to the system, but at the same time, the threat has to be existential enough that like people are actually spurred into it. So sort of like crafting that narrative is certainly an interesting framing for this thing.
Yeah, that's kind of classic Democrats, though, right? Because it's like next election, gotta vote. Could be really bad.
Next election, the Greenland ice sheet's gonna melt.
yeah, if you don't fucking vote and change your light bulbs, Joe Biden will personally destroy the Greenland
turn off
glaciers.
the Gulf Stream.
That was. I was surprised to see him talk about that. I was like, I didn't realize that was like really fully in the discussion. Then he doesn't that's something that he kind of downplays because it's like, well, that could be bad. That could be very bad.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the interesting things for me to look back over to that period, I suppose, is like what they imagine climate change was going to look like, and I mean, maybe it's that stupid film with Jake Gyllenhaal. I don't know, but
Day After Tomorrow. I think he was at the premiere and he gave this lecture at the premiere, which is very funny.
But I feel like the threat of the Gulf Stream stopping was really synonymous with the threat of global warming in people's discussions of it at the time when this documentary came out, I guess.
Yeah, true.
Or in this era, I suppose.
Yeah, and also just like the immediate aftermath of Katrina, which he does touch on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, man, again, once more, the Bush years. That was an insane disaster. And, Gore here is like, it was a disaster, and shows, like heart-rending clips of people like, stuck in their flooded attics and stuff like that. But it's like, what he doesn't talk about? It's like, he doesn't talk about cops just picking people off, Black Americans predominantly, obviously. He doesn't talk about how it was predominantly Black Americans that died because they lived right next to the really shitty levee. Like, that was the only part where I got like mad, because it was like immediately following him being like, this isn't political, now let's talk about Katrina. I was just like, whoa, okay. Like, yeah it's interesting. That's like, this was a big talking point for like American reactionaries about this movie, where it was like, well, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, do you think climate change is real? Like, there's no way of knowing whether Katrina was caused by climate change. There's no way of knowing whether he talks about Lake Chad. I think there's no way of knowing whether Lake Chad drying up is a result of climate change. And it's like, technically that is true, right? Because it's like, weather isn't like a linear thing where it's like, this year we had 3 Category 5 hurricanes, up from 2.5 last year. You know what I mean? But it is, obviously, like, now I think that argument has kind of died, just because it's like, oh, 2% of California burned down again this year, up from like 1.5 last year. You know what I mean? And it is kind of hard to just be like, who knows? And also just because like a lot of the people with lived experience of these things, like probably like were Republican voters at a certain point too. You know what I mean? Or just non-voters.
Maybe it's the fault of the homeless, Joe.
Yeah, exactly. How does NIMBYism tie into this? I'm not sure. Affordable housing. You better not be for that. No, what are you gonna do? It was a trip. It was a trip.
Yeah.
When he does the photos of the glaciers, it's just like, that's kind of relatively early on, and I was just like, God, how much worse must it be now? Because he's
Mhm.
showing like in the last 20 years, these glaciers have done this. And it's like, oh my God, it's 20 years since
I was
then.
thinking like, how are people still living in these places? You know?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Huh. Well, yeah. So that's that. It's a trip. I think the only reason like I really wanted to talk about this was just because it's such an excellent example of like the limits to a thoroughly like capitalist propaganda. And it was just interesting to see the Democrats try and engage in propaganda in a way that was like, oh, good for you.
I thought the only reason we wanted to talk about this was the sort of like Matt Groening, Troy McClure insert, like Simpsons public service broadcast into the middle.
That was so of its era too. He's like, how can I get the kids on board? I'll do a Futurama
crossover.
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting too. The last thing I'll say is that I think that this is probably like a pretty if you had to pick a starting point, maybe I'd be interested in if you think this like a starting point for the kind of like I love science ideology. It's kind of here because it's kind of like, you know, I mean, Christopher Caldwell was kind of like critiquing this like 100 years ago, but it is kind of the beginning of the American like neoliberal, we're smarter than you. Maybe we should just try and get university graduates to vote for us and kind of like fuck those blue collar workers, which now is kind of crumbled and maybe they're going to need to pivot. Although knowing the Democrats, it probably won't. So especially now that nobody can afford to go to college. So
yeah, I mean, it is very much in line with the strategies that we've come to recognize as the democratic one. So as a sort of cultural pivot point, I suppose it definitely makes sense as that. Yeah, and like the sort of like, I mean, I guess one of we've made this point already, but like one of the reasons, the political reasons why it has to pivot toward this sort of personalized consumerist response to climate change is one, so that it can sort of like pander to the liberal democratic voter who wants to think, I'm doing my part, what about other people? And also it gives them an opportunity to like hate on somebody else. So it's like it's almost the more pernicious side of the culture war, which is the democratic one, which is like feeding it but claiming to not be, like claiming not to be partisan. And no wonder they couldn't carry portions of the working class with them, when the narrative is like, you should just spend money that you don't have, as you say, buy the better light bulbs or whatever, and like give up the car that you've like that's essential to the sort of last vestiges of your wealth and your lifestyle that you're trying to hold on to. No, you have to sort of overhaul everything and give it up. And I guess if we were being really critical, we could carry that critique into a reflection on the sort of like Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil era of climate activism, which in some ways I respect the sort of like really putting yourself on the line sort of demand for change, but interlaced with that obviously is a degree of like bad, coming back to what you were saying about what would be good public communication around these issues. There is certainly a degree to which that represents quite bad PR for solving the climate crisis, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, bad PR. Like, I don't know. I'm never gonna. I think I'm just much more disgusted by the people in the videos of the Just Stop Oil people blocking roads. I'm much more disgusted by the like pickup truck driving assholes that are like violent towards them. Like,
yeah,
I've got loads of sympathy for those people and good for them. But you're absolutely right that this is like, definitely that stuff is definitely like an outgrowth of this kind of like ideology. Yeah. I suppose go ahead.
I don't know. I just sort of wonder to what extent we're just forced to fight the culture war that,
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. I remember once when I was a teenager and I was at the, proverbial but also quite literal like Thanksgiving table with all of my like uncles that just try and get people like angry with their culture war stuff. And I remember very vividly one time just not responding and it just being like, oh, and then it just stopped and we started talking about the turkey or something like that. It's like, if you get a chance to not engage in the culture war, just don't do it. Like, I know
Yeah.
that obviously I have much less to lose than some people in that regard. Maybe I just have no self-respect. Maybe that's the key.
Yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it just is the politics of capitalism, you know, like
Yeah.
there is no other progressive solution other than activism in sort of like in a politics that's defined by the social relations of capitalism, I guess. Like
One thing, yeah, but I'm finding it, you know, I almost feel like that's changing because like around here, the biggest activism is housing crisis stuff. And like they've won like a lot of really cool victories, but just like with climate change activism, just like with a bunch of different types of activism, it's like becoming obvious that that's kind of not working either. You know what I mean? Like in the kind of like Brennerite way of, you know, much fewer pieces of the pie to go around. So capitalists are just not interested in reforms anymore. You know what I mean? It's like that activism is kind of stalling. And so people are going to be forced to start thinking about things differently. Did this movie make me optimistic? It might have made me optimistic in a really weird way. That's fine.
Well, I feel like you've just sort of touched in on the opportunity structures that are offered to us by climate breakdown.
Great.
Jason Moore, right? It's like,
I mean, it's funny,
you know,
right?
it's
like,
we can no longer carry on this facade at the point when like it all just becomes about self-preservation.
Yeah.
And the hand of the ruling class is revealed in all of its sort of like, you know,
different forms.
Yeah. Well, it is in as a clenched fist, I guess.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, does this movie have any like? Does this movie give us any lessons? I suppose I was thinking like language is very important because it came. I know I've been using this phrase this entire episode, but like it came across as very bourgeois suddenly that he was using the phrase climate change because it felt very Anthropocene and almost to the point of like more than that, where it's like, this is just something that happens. It's changing. The climate is changing as opposed to just like being actively destroyed by capitalist social relations. You know what I mean? It's like language matters in that way. And I suppose if you really want to take the act of like radical pedagogy seriously, like you got to take all that stuff seriously. You got to take action very seriously. And on the other hand, to give Gore his flowers, as the kids would say, you could do a lot worse than learning how to speak to people than watching him speak. Because again, like he's very calm. He knows what he's doing, but he knows when to be serious and he knows when to be like, I lost the election. God, boy, gosh, wouldn't everything be better for me, that son of a tobacco plantation owner? I do love that was like the better way for him to talk about his family, as opposed to my dad was an oil magnate, that he had to be like, my dad owned a tobacco plantation in Tennessee. It's so funny.
But he learnt the error of his ways, so it's fine.
The error of his ways after his daughter died of lung cancer. It's like, oh my. Then he went into a much more reputable business of selling petroleum. Anyway, what are you going to do? Yeah, I'm fascinated in this stuff. I'm fascinated in the ways in which ideas are like transmitted to people, and I'm fascinated in, I think more so in the way that like progressive liberals try to do this, because on one hand, like I said, there are lessons, but on the other hand, there are lessons to do the opposite. And in terms of like phrasing, in terms of vocabulary, I think that, you know, the capitalist scene is probably like a really good word to try and get out there in the zeitgeist, because it does capture, you know, despite being kind of like negative in its response to Anthropocene, like it is pretty positive, and it's like, oh, this is what's going on, like in a way that like anybody can understand. You know what I mean? Great. I love, man, every 5 minutes when it cut back to him talking about his life and he's tapping away on his little computer on PowerPoint. It's so funny. Because I said to my partner, I was like, you know that this movie is just a PowerPoint, right? And she was like, ha ha ha. And then we turned it on and she was like, this is just a PowerPoint?
I mean, it's a great, like, I don't, like, it's, why that? I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't know why that style of documentary. I mean, maybe it plays to his strength. Maybe it sort of like champions the activism that he is doing, giving these talks. Maybe it's like, hey, remember, I was the vice president and I did like presidential debates and I stood on stages and, you know, I don't know. Why was that? Why was this the way this was presented? I guess.
I think probably because the producer or director probably saw him do it and was like,
Yeah, it's like,
let's just spend $1 million, make this movie and see what happens. Turn it into a
let's
movie.
film some inserts and
Yeah, exactly.
get some bad CGI.
Some very bad CGI. Some very bad CGI. Oh, well. All right. Well, yeah. You can watch this movie and be really depressed, or you can watch this movie and be slightly less depressed, I would say. But it is just a fascinating, as you said at the beginning, now historical kind of thing, which is grim. Mm-hmm. Historical, Dan. Anyway, all right. Well, that's that. The reason, it's so funny because one of the reasons I suggest we do this is because we're reading the Jasper Burns book for the next episode, and it's like a whole book. And I was like, okay, we should give ourselves a bit more time to read it. And then the book showed up, and it's like 100 pages. Yeah. I was like, okay, well, whatever. We already said we're doing this episode, so all right.
Hey, it's good fun.
All right, Dan. Well, thank you very much for this.
Yeah. Hopefully, it's excites some of your.
Yeah. I think I just needed a safe space to talk about this movie because it just blew my mind.
Yeah.
Having seen it when it came out and it being so important to like my political progression, and then now seeing it, I was like, this is what young Jack believed. Oh my God. What are you gonna do? Anyway, pulled me back into a dark era. I'm sure we'll be in 20 years when we do an episode on how to blow up a pipeline, we'll be pulled back into these years doing the same thing. What are you gonna do? All right. Well, thank you very much, Dan. I had a blast.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. See everybody next time.
See you. Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us if we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.